This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everybody to our first seminar of the new year. We're happy to welcome Dr. Bryce Evans from Liverpool Hope, who's going to be talking about national kitchens in the First World War. And it's kind of interesting that food is now becoming much more important than it used to be, and what with the kind of food banks, etc. It's interesting to kind of go back to the actual history of food. So I'll hand you over to Croydon.
Well, thank you very much, Misa, and thanks to Colin, who's not here, for the invitation. And it's interesting that you mentioned the food bank, because one of the reasons why I was interested in this research, if you wouldn't mind touching the lights there, just you might be able to see the image better. Well, one of the reasons I started researching national kitchens was, first of all, the Wellcome Trust gave me some money, which was always nice. But in my spare time, I run a sort of charitable venture, a community kitchen, very distinct from a food bank, which we could go on to discuss. But with the aware that us historians should avoid anachronism and letting the contemporary intrude on the historical. That's really where my interest in communal dining and food poverty, if you like, if you could use that contemporary and loaded term, came from. So I suppose today we're familiar with this, as Mita says, we're familiar with the food bank, we're familiar with other approaches, community kitchens, community cafes, social supermarkets, some of you might have heard of. What I think is missing from some of the debate today is the historical nuances and the historical precedents in this country with communal dining in particular. And if we look in the British experience of total war in the 20th century, in the Second World War, some of you may have heard of the national restaurants. They persisted into the 50s, most of them between 1940 and 47. These were state-subsidised communal dining ventures, national restaurants. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister, of course, christened them British restaurants because he felt that the Ministry of Food's original moniker, communal feeding centres, was, quote, too redolent of communism and the workhouse. So they underwent a rebranding, and there were 2,000 national restaurants operating in Britain in the Second World War at their peak, and there's been some very good work on them by Peter Atkins. And yet the national restaurants of the Second World War had their very underdocumented predecessor, and that was the national kitchen of the First World War, which partly or largely inspired them in the Second World War. So national kitchens in the First World War were locally administered, but part of a major state-sponsored, government-sponsored program to alleviate food poverty and its effects. Interestingly, as I want to discuss with you today, they grew out of working-class female efforts to combat wartime supply disruption and price inflation. And then they get taken on by the state in May 1917. At the signing of the armistice in September 1918, there are 363 national kitchens in Britain, but the number is probably, that's officially registered, but the number is higher, as we'll discuss. So how have national kitchens been dealt with by historians? Well, they're mentioned in passing in a lot of the works discussed in the First World War and British wartime food policy, but they lack their own history. Unlike the national restaurant of the Second World War, the First World War national kitchen has not been viewed kindly by historians. I could quote many disparaging remarks about national kitchens, but Margaret Barnett, great historian of the First World War, says that national kitchens were, she acknowledges, the fruit of a new idealism, as she says, which took place in the latter stages of the war, but they failed, according to Barnett, to move beyond the old soup kitchen model. These remained, and I quote, stolidly lower-class institutions located in dingy back streets or public baths and presided over by the familiar Lady Bountiful. According to Barnett, despite, and perhaps maybe because of, as we'll discover, support from prominent women such as Sylvia Pankhurst and Queen Mary, egalitarianism in public dining or communal dining held little appeal for the British public. And Barnett says this is because the unexotic air of social levelling, communism and fair shares hung over the venture. So Barnett there echoing Churchill's appraisal of communal dining, if you like. But like other aspects of wartime food policy, I'd argue that the fate of national kitchens, because theirs was a brief existence from 1917 to 1919, had really more to do with political will than public indifference. I would argue that they're actually quite popular, national kitchens, and as late as mid-1918 the Ministry of Food is talking confidently of national kitchens becoming, quote, a permanent national institution in Britain. Their demise, for by 1919 they were no more, it's argued here was due to political factors. The government's decision to introduce full rationing, of course, but also, and interestingly, the vocal opposition to them from, you can probably guess whom.
Conservatives.
Yes, and the restaurant trade. The catering trade didn't like them at all. And that general dismantling of the collectivist ethic, I suppose, is to blame. So what I want to discuss today is how the voluntarist ethos of community kitchens becomes the national kitchen in the First World War. So to start off with talking about communal kitchens, if I scroll on to this slide here, communal kitchens or community kitchens, as they're called at the time, exist, of course, before the war. They exist as soup kitchens. They predate the outbreak of war, of course, in 1914. But during wartime, because of price inflation, etc., these charitable kitchens assume heightened importance, especially as price inflation begins to bite by 1917. And in big cities, you get groups like, predominantly women's groups, like the Patriotic Food League, who actually in some cases travel to women's homes to help them in terms of cookery, or other venues such as London's Invalid Kitchens, run by the humanitarian Muriel Paget, and again predominantly female run, as all these efforts are in the early stages, or as this image shows, the so-called cost-price canteens, and that's the cost-price canteen of the East London Federation of Suffragettes. With the intensification of war, though, these community kitchens undergo, I suppose, or fall victim to the reorganisation of society under Lloyd George's Push and Go ministry from December 1916. Of course, as you know, there's a heightened U-boat campaign in 1917. There's a commission of inquiry, interestingly, in the spring of 1917, which links labour unrest to food price inflation. And that commission of inquiry recommends, one of its key recommendations is the opening of industrial canteens, so canteens located in workplaces and factories. In May 1917, the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, appoints fellow Welshman and millionaire businessman D.A. Thomas, better known as Lord Ronda, and that's him, as his food controller. Now, Ronda's appointment signals a switch to swift state action. But for all of Ronda's, I suppose, heady statism when it came to the food issue, at the start of the war he's really in favour of voluntary action when it comes to British dining habits. There's some things he introduces, sort of rationing by early rationing of certain foodstuffs, restrictions in certain restaurant menus. But initially when it comes to people eating together or dining together, Ronda, his early preference is for voluntarism, and in May 1917 Ronda issues a public appeal for more voluntary communal kitchens. So at this stage the government is using the rhetoric of communal kitchens. It wants voluntary action, it wants people, especially women, to do their bit off their own bat. Ronda, though, while he's issuing this public appeal, appoints one of his understudies at the ministry, a man called Kennedy Jones. Kennedy Jones was former unionist politician, former journalist, contests the 1916 Wimbledon election, as you probably know, on the radical right-wing ticket of the Do It Now party. And Kennedy Jones is tasked with searching for a good example of successful communal dining, which the state can use as a template, and which can be used by local authorities who might want to take the idea on. Now, one model which the ministry considers, or Kennedy Jones considers, is the Croydon Communal Kitchen. That was a very successful London venture in communal dining, established by the local borough council, staffed by a paid cook, but a team of voluntary helpers. And significantly, this form of communal dining was takeaway. People would go there with buckets and bowls and other vessels which they want filled up with food, and they then pay for a little chit or ticket, get the bowls filled up and leave. But Kennedy Jones looks at that model and decides he's not going to go with it, and instead he settles on a group of prominent middle-class food reformers, R. Hipsley Cox, H.J. Bradley and Eustace Miles. And these three, this triumvirate of very sort of hip middle-class food reformers, are used to spearhead the new kitchens for all, as they're called at this time. And I think the nomenclature is really quite important. So at this stage, these three middle-class food reformers, all men notably, are used to produce a booklet about the state's kitchens for all. And they dutifully do so. And it results in the opening of the first kitchen for all, sponsored by the state. It's not a particularly good photograph, but it's on Westminster Bridge, or near Westminster Bridge. And in contrast to the Croydon scheme, which was very much a sort of working class effort, which gave calories to take away, essentially, the model that the ministry takes on is influenced by these food reformers and their interest in diet and dining habits and nutrition. And instead of the takeaway, then they take on the form of big communal dining. And so that's behind the opening of this first kitchen for all, opened by Queen Mary on the 21st of May 1917. And by the end of the year, by the end of 1917, you had kitchens for all, or as they're soon rebranded, as we'll find out, national kitchens, popping up in every British town and city. So what of this brave new world of communal dining, and why am I being so careful and fastidious about the name and the names of these communal kitchens, kitchens for all, and latterly national kitchens? Well, to illustrate my point, I'd like to quote from the booklet which is drawn up by Cox, Bradley and Miles, who are the guys tasked by the ministry in coming up with a public kitchens handbook. And I'll compete against the pneumatic drill outside as I do so. So I quote from the first page of that booklet. Cox, Bradley and Miles say, and I quote, "Probably at some future time it would be difficult to believe that each household in the country did its own separate marketing, buying and gaining small amounts of food from retail dealers 100% above cost price, and that every 100 houses in any street would have its own fire for cooking, and that at least 100 human beings were engaged in serving meals that could have been prepared by half a dozen communally." So it's very much a sort of brave new world of communal dining. Why do we all travel to the shop or eventually the supermarket to get stuff separately? Doesn't it just make sense that we purchase in bulk and do things together? And that's the verdict and the ethos of the Public Kitchens Handbook. Now the term public kitchens is significant. The grassroots origin of these communal kitchens run by predominantly working class women, be they humanitarians or suffragettes, they inspire these public kitchens, but this is soon going to be very much obscured by their patriotic rebranding. So this communal dining centre, the Kitchen for All, is opened by Queen Mary on the 21st of May. It's called a kitchen for all, not a public kitchen, significantly. Later it becomes a national kitchen. These are more than just linguistic idiosyncrasies. This brave new world of communal dining would be riddled with political anxieties, and you can probably guess why. The prospect of the great unwashed assembling all together and actually talking and eating together. And illustrative of this is the actions that Rhondda takes at the ministry, Lord Rhondda. So Rhondda, as food controller, in November 1917, after tasking Jones with getting together these food reformers, has a change of tack and appoints a business friend of his, Charles Spencer, to head up the new, as it's called, Kitchens Division of the Ministry of Food. Now Spencer really is a quite annoying self-made man who can't stop talking, like most self-made men, about the hardship he's gone through and the wondrous path to business success he's created for himself. He's a Yorkshireman, and he's a friend of Rhondda's of long standing and long political affiliation. And Rhondda is told by Spencer, and you can see this is a letter from Spencer to Rhondda. When he's appointed, Spencer, who's actually a tramways magnate, he started developing trams up in the north in Halifax, and he's been a alderman and I think Lord Mayor of Halifax. And he says to Rhondda, "If I'm going to be head of your kitchens division, I'm not used to being chained up." Very much a self-styled man of action, takes on the post in the condition that it be, quote, untrammelled by red tape, and that he pretty much does what he wants, and that it be run, quote, as a business proposition. So already the kitchens division is going from its voluntarist origins to something a lot more oriented towards the business mind. And Spencer confesses to Rhonda in a similar dispatch to this one that he doesn't quite, and I quote, does not feel quite happy with the term communal. Quote, its association with socialism is well known, and I'm afraid it's rather a handicap. So he suggests, this is Spencer, the new head of the Kitchens Division, to Food Controller Rhonda, the following alternatives. He says, why don't we call them War Emergency Food Kitchens, War Food Depots, War Catering Depots, National Food Kitchens, Local Catering Centres, National Catering Centres, People's Food Supply Depots, Local Food Kitchens, or Food Supply Depots. An exhaustive list, but all of them getting rid of the word communal, because obviously there's a taint of socialism there. And from this unwieldy sounding list, Rhonda and Spencer agree on the term national kitchen, because it sounds suitably patriotic and really quite uncommunal. So, pre-echoing Churchill's concern, 30 years later, the community kitchen dies and becomes rebranded the national kitchen. So the anti-communism of Rhonda and Spencer was expressed paradoxically, I suppose, amidst increasingly statist measures in food control. Under the extended powers of the Defence of the Realm Act, Rhonda had seen the state overtake food supply, purchase, control, distribution, pricing by September 1917. So somewhat paradoxically, against this backdrop, they are still very much against the communal when it comes to mass dining. So how were national kitchens organised? I'd like to tell you a little bit about how the new National Kitchens division under Spencer and Rhonda at the Ministry of Food functioned. The fanfare surrounding the opening of the Westminster Bridge, the Kitchen for All, soon gives way to confusion. There's a great deal of uncertainty amongst local councils, local authorities. Can they fund these new entities? What's the pricing structure? Who is actually providing the capital? There's also confusion over the role of local food vigilance committees. And food vigilance committees, as you know, were generally grassroots bodies supported by the labour movement in an effort to ensure fair distribution of food, predominantly amongst working class communities. So would food vigilance committees be involved in these? There was a lot of confusion in the early stages. In your food vigilance committees, you are likely to find women typical of those who are standing in the food queues that are starting to develop in 1917 and 1918. In the, of course, heavily gendered world of food preparation, it was also becoming clear that the success of national kitchens, as they were now being rebranded, depended on local political backing. In Liverpool, for example, the Lord Mayor of the city declares that there will be no national kitchens in Liverpool. Why? Because such sites should only provide, and I quote, supplementary foods such as porridge and soups, and should never displace the role of the housewife. Likewise, in Newcastle, the local council is very worried about the threat to the position of the housewife that this brave new role of communal dining presents. Okay, so reflecting some of these concerns, food vigilance committees themselves are soon to be disappointed. Spencer was very suspicious of these bodies, and who could blame him? They contained lots of working class women. And he declares himself not oriented towards food vigilance committees, that national kitchens would not become class kitchens, as he put it. In an obsequious dispatch to Rhonda, instead he argues that elite patronage is the way to go. Rather than bottom up, he wants top down. To Rhonda he writes, and I quote, and this is from January 1918, and I quote, "There is no one that the working woman looks up to like a lord. I have found it so in electioneering times. A lord on a platform will draw more working women to any hall than anyone else. We should have to get..." Pass the sick bucket. We should have to get noble lords and ladies to patronise our national kitchens and have the fact well-pressed campaigns. So you see Spencer there, a desire for noble patronage. Now, interestingly, when he takes this to the ministry, they're not having it. The most significant instruction that the civil servants in the ministry include in this the National Kitchens Handbook, which is published in late 1917. And you'll notice at this stage they're already becoming national restaurants as well, which is another kettle of fish. This is published in late 1917, and the most significant instruction in there, against Spencer's guff about lords and ladies, is that national kitchens, and I quote, were not to be conducted as a charity, and they were not to feature a philanthropic Lady Bountiful or Lord Bountiful, as in the past. The Ministry of Food's National Kitchens Handbook, which you see here, warns against any spirit of condescension or patronage towards customers. Kitchens would, on the one hand, avoid the taint of charity, quote, the taint of charity, and on the other, be conducted without loss to the ratepayer or taxpayer. So they had to be business concerns that break even. They're not going to be voluntarist, and they're not going to feature a lord or lady, according to civil servants under Spencer. And they were to be popular ventures rather than schemes solely for the very, very poor. Significantly, most national kitchens become run by local businessmen and are overseen by local government. An interesting footnote is that national restaurants in the Second World War, Margaret Thatcher's father, actually, I discovered this recently, ran a national restaurant in the Second World War. So you perhaps get the idea that they are, the startup of national kitchens is often down to local entrepreneurs before they get taken on by local government. They're then assisted by a treasury grant. So you have to, if you're setting up a national kitchen, you have to prove that it's viable over 3 months. And then, if you've covered your costs, the treasury would give you a large grant covering about a quarter of the capital, and then a further grant to tide you over. So they're state sanctioned at that level, but at the initial impetus has to be really from a local businessman. Where does all this leave us? In an early 1918 Commons debate, as noted, working class women who had performed, quote, the pioneer work in starting public kitchens were now finding themselves elbowed aside and marginalised by this new order. Voluntary communal kitchens run by working class women, from which the national kitchen, now so called, had sprung, could be established or re-established in the future, contended Spencer, but only if they subjected themselves to local authority supervision, and that, of course, meant coming under his supervision. Now, to go inside the communal kitchen, what was a national kitchen actually like? Let's take you on a little tour. Well, this is, again, suitably space age, that's a bit of an anachronism, but you get the idea, sort of forward-looking plan of the national kitchen, and that's the kitchen for all inside the kitchen for all on Westminster Bridge. You can see lots of different rooms, compartments, really quite well planned and laid out with storage and cooking areas and lavatories. It's run by a small staff, 2 cooks, 2 kitchen maids, a superintendent and a cashier, and they'd serve up to and beyond 2,000 people a day. Customers purchase coupons from a cashier entering the premises rather than handing over money directly, and they then hand this over for a range of food. There's a discount in terms of retail price because the state brokers deals with shippers and import dealers. So these savings are then sort of transferred to the customer at cost price. Another crucial aspect in how national kitchens were different from their voluntary soup kitchens was the need to keep up appearances. The ministry in its handbook says that each outlet, and I quote, must not resemble a soup kitchen. It must be a place where ordinary people in ordinary circumstances can purchase an attractive yet cheap meal. Staff had to be well dressed, it instructed, and cooks had to be experienced. Amazingly, it also says that the decor can't be chintzy at all. It recommends gramophones and pianos in every site to add to the ambience. So, a cheap dining experience with pianos. This is revolutionary stuff indeed. That's what the one in Westminster Bridge looked like inside. So a big, really, long tables and the rest. But this ethic that, they were kitchens for all and they wouldn't be, sort of doss houses, if you like, is captured in the Scarborough Post. And the Scarborough Post reports on Hull's national kitchen, and I'll just quote this to you. This is from October 1918. The Hull people do not go into a back street. They avail of commanding premises in a good and busy thoroughfare. They fit their premises on modern lines, and there is no suspicion of shabby genteelness. On the contrary, were it not for the artistically painted signs, you'd never dream it was a national kitchen. The place has the appearance of being a prosperous cafe business. It is dainty and pleasing to the eye. The goods delivered are appetising. The business done is enormous. So far, 14 kitchens have been started in Hull alone. In a further move away from the charitable aspect of the kitchen, you can see that they're very well equipped. You know, they're getting central funding to be very well equipped. You know, modern cookers, stoves, all the rest. And Spencer insists as well that employees be paid, that there be no voluntary staff whatsoever on these premises. As Spencer puts it, and I quote, anybody's work is nobody's work. You cannot dismiss a voluntary worker, you have to appeal to him. I do not want well-meaning amateurs in the national kitchens. Now, to progress to some of the administrative concerns, food control committees. By December 1917, as food queues are lengthening, you have the extension of full rationing on the horizon, which comes in January 1918, as you'll know. Before that, Rhondda introduces things like flour and potato subsidies and empowers local councils to control food via locally appointed food control committees. Now, food control committees are, again, different to those earlier food vigilance committees, generally composed of trade professionals rather than our working class women, professionals familiar with food supply and distribution. And it's been claimed by studies such as Karen Hunt's that working class women are largely absent from these new bodies. The Ministry for Food encourages local authorities to take over national kitchens where food vigilance committees had decided to shut theirs down. This move further removes national kitchens from their voluntary origins, tying them up to the purse strings of local and national government. Now, these transitions didn't wholly remove bottom-up action in communal feeding in the First World War. I'm not suggesting that. You do have instances of women setting up, women workers particularly setting up cafes and restrooms and canteens up and down the country. Leeds, Liverpool, you get a lot of examples. And trying to run them independently of food control committees or of the state. But the food supply situation by this late stage of the war, with fluctuations in price, rationing and supplies accompanied by national orders, means that practically speaking any independent efforts actually had to dialogue with food control committees, and that effectively meant coming under Spencer at the National Kitchens Division, as it now was, of the Ministry for Food. So what about demand for these kitchens? Well, if you look, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I challenged the historiography to say that they weren't popular, or rather that there wasn't a popular demand for them. By mid-1918, the largest national kitchen in London, which is in Hammersmith, is feeding incredibly 50,000 people a day. The biggest in Manchester, only 3,000, but again, that's significant numbers. Even villages, which are classed by the Ministry of Food as settlements of 1,000 people or less, are urged by the Ministry to turn their local kitchens or local village halls into a national kitchen or a village national kitchen or village canteen. Village canteens were also subject to special ministry instructions. Soup had to be accompanied by food items which could easily be taken into the field, for example, Cornish pasties. And you look at how these function and exist up and down the length of the country. I mean, there's many of them in London. Sheffield alone has 6, as we've heard, according to the Scarborough Post. Hull has 14, Nottingham has 18, Middlesbrough has 3, Bootle has 5. So there is an awful lot of these sites functioning. But as national kitchens expand their operation in 1918, and as the war grinds on, longer-term considerations to do with nutrition and public health come to feature. A window into the operation and future prospects of National Kitchen is provided by Marian Phillips. Phillips, of course, the first Australian woman to win a seat in the National Parliament, a member of the Women's Labour League and the Consumer Council, and a Fabian as well. And she goes and investigates these national kitchens as they exist in London at the time and writes a long memorandum on them and her opinion of them. She's generally supportive of the principle of communal dining. She thinks it's a positive thing, and she's very confident that post-war all working class housing estates will have a national kitchen on site. And yet she also is quite perceptive in talking about the problems that the National Kitchen is going to face. These challenges really are born with the extension of rationing, in particular meat rationing, and she reports that people now receiving food individually, or well, on a family basis if you like, via the ration, and meat particularly via the ration, that there'd been instances in National Kitchens where patrons had refused to give up their coupons for the meat on offer. They turned up their nose at the meat on offer. And the steady introduction of this more comprehensive rationing system, as documented by Phillips in her memo, is soon to sound the National Kitchen's death knell. Before we get on to the death of National Kitchens, I just think it might be interestingly to dip into the Public Kitchens Handbook again to actually explore what kind of foods they had on offer. At the turn of the century in Britain, we know free trade is a popular pre-war policy. The cheap white loaf is, as has been documented by many, that symbol of national pride. At the same time, this nationalistic pride in cheap white loaf, celebrating, of course, a global system of trade, still is wrapped up in an Edwardian culture which scorns so-called alien cultures of consumption. And the Public Kitchens Handbook is of that time, and it displays an awareness of these popular Edwardian attitudes. Its authors, this triumvirate of middle-class vegetarians, actually, or at least 2 or 3 of them are vegetarians, advises that to ensure long-term popularity, the National Kitchen should, quote, bow to prejudice by serving established, heavy British meat-based dishes. The guidebook can't help but get a little bit snobby in criticising the, quote, appalling ignorance of the British public when it comes to eating well and to preparing food attractively. This situation, which the handbook's authors term a national disgrace, had led to the neglect of many different cuisines, most notably those of the pleasant land of France, the shrine of all true chefs, as they put it. Yet foreign cuisines and the greater use of vegetables, because of the food supply situation in the war, of course, should be introduced only gradually, they warned, because they're worried that these national kitchens are going to be seen as lofty, vegetarian, avant-garde ventures. So instead they say that gravies should be prepared in the British way, from the juices of the meat, and not in many restaurants where foreigners rule, from a mixed meat gravy. And they're aware of a worry that the public are just going to see these as really the state pushing desirable trends on them. So that the handbook says that the public have a suspicion that national kitchens will only serve bland bean-based dishes, and so it instructs its proponents that taste is paramount, stimulation of the digestive fluids, helping to extract the full food value, whereas dull cooking would leave the digestive fluids inert. So they're striking a balance at the Ministry of Food and their advisors between the heavy meat-based Edwardian diet that was popular in Britain at the time, and this desire to improve nutrition, as well with food restrictions, supply restrictions in the war, and the concern that people weren't actually eating all that well. So let's go on to the sad death of the National Kitchen, and that's the National Kitchen in Glasgow. And as you can see from it, it's a really grandiose building. That's a really prominent building. Again, it doesn't look shabby whatsoever. You have the Crown logo and the NK logo there. And in August 1918, if you read the minutes of Glasgow Corporation, they had a special committee, as most city corporations did, on national kitchens. And in August 1918, the Glasgow Corporation's Special Committee on National Kitchens is approached by a 6-man deputation from the Glasgow District Restaurateurs and Hotel Keepers Association, and they are very angry. And the restaurateurs are angry because they've gotten wind that this is about to open, and that it's going to be run in the city centre as a national restaurant. This central location, they claimed, would be hugely detrimental to the restaurant trade in the city. What annoyed the Glasgow restaurateurs most was the location. This was based on the busy, bustling Argyle Road in Glasgow, in the centre of Glasgow, so it's not going to be located in the slums. It's right in the middle of the city centre. This isn't something for the very poor or the marginalised, if you like. This is a kitchen for all. And the restaurant trade is very, very upset about this. And slowly this grows into a national resistance to national restaurants, which is coinciding with this introduction of a comprehensive rationing. And the restaurant trade accuses, says that they're not trying to profiteer at a time of scarcity, of course not. But they say that the very principle of state-subsidised restaurants flies in the face of that quintessential British value, the notion of fair play. With the post-war, and as the war comes to its halt, obviously the post-war return to normal trading conditions, this argument's going to gain weight. The restaurant trade proponents of so-called fair play really found the whiff of vested interests here in state backing and the big state backing the big national kitchen very malodorous. Now Spencer, when approached, Spencer's a hard-headed man of business himself, and he's quite shocked by this. He seems to generally not see communal dining backed by the state as a threat to private restaurants. He says that they can coexist, and the way that they can coexist is they can buy cooperatively in order to force down prices and pass the savings on to consumers and reduce waste in doing so. It's an argument, though, which held little weight with private retailers. And if the introduction of full rationing in the summer of 1918 diminishes the appeal of communal dining, the opposition of restaurants and the restaurant trade confirms it. And it confirms that national kitchens also had travelled quite a long way from their voluntarist origins to what they've now become. The armistice of November 1918 was to provide another blow to the broad ethic of collectivism, I suppose more broadly, and is followed by the post-war winding down of the Ministry of Food, and with it, the forward march of the national kitchen is steadily brought to a halt. At the turn of the year, a downbeat Spencer throws in his hat and resigns as director. And he declares, he writes a long and sad goodbye note, and he says, "The national restaurant was a war measure, and it can now be closed down with profit and credit to all concerned." His idea of cooperation with the private trade had now been jettisoned. To keep going would, quote, merely set up national competition with the restaurant trade without any direct advantage to the state. So at the turn of the year he departs his post, and he's replaced by the man who initially scoped out the national kitchen, Kennedy Jones. And Kennedy Jones, when he gets in post, accuses his colleague, the Yorkshireman Spencer, of reckless expenditure and reckless expansion of national kitchens, and immediately announces a series of cuts to the national kitchens apparatus nationwide. What's interesting, though, is that national kitchens, they've come a long way from their voluntarist origins, servicing, if you like, the poor and the working class, but you still have a National Kitchens Advisory Committee at this stage, which significantly is made up of women such as Maud Pember Reeves, who you all know, around about £1 a week, famous anti-poverty campaigner. And she really campaigns very strongly following the end of the war and into 1919 that closing national kitchens would be disastrous in British urban centres. She uses that term. And the, quote, the moral effects of closure very bad. But she's not listened to. Under Kennedy Jones, the ministry at this stage is busy selling off all its national restaurants to, you guessed it, the private restaurant trade. And yet, amidst all these closures in 1919, there are still new kitchens opening. I think this demonstrates partly that there was still a demand for the service of, cheap dining in nice surroundings. In January 1919, the Ministry's Kitchens Advisory Committee, of which Reeves was a member, is discussing the possibility that maybe they could morph into taking over the civil service canteens in London. Meanwhile, the Manchester Guardian is claiming that national kitchens are actually being established at a greater rate after the war than during it, and that's probably true, but they're also being closed down at the same time. So, to come to a conclusion soon enough, resisting the winding down of their very department, staff, the civil servants in the National Kitchens Division of the Ministry of Food produce a very bullish internal memo boasting the continued success of what they call the NK movement. The language used is very indicative of that forward-looking spirit accompanying egalitarian eating, if you will, in the later stages of the war. And they report that in Cheltenham, there's a brand new national kitchen open in late 1919, serving a range of mouth-watering foodstuffs from roast beef to apple puffs. Cornish pasties and shepherd's pie on offer in Sunderland's national kitchen are exceptional. Newcastle gets its first kitchen in April 1919, and Liverpool as well. So the newsletter claims that they're actually, although the policy of the ministry is to shut them down, they're actually popping up because they're still needed, and it rubbishes claims that they're not needed in the post-war period. And it particularly seizes on a report that one local authority in the country had closed its national kitchen because of the expense of hiring waitresses and tablecloths. And there's a really sort of thinly veiled contempt for the, if you like, bourgeois character of the post-war world in this memo. National kitchens may have been overall declining in Britain, but also the civil servants at the National Kitchens Division of the Ministry of Food report that it's taking off elsewhere. Cities like Vienna and Hamburg, they talk about how state-sponsored communal dining schemes are functioning, and they even talk about how the movement, as they put it, and they do use that term movement, had spread to the United States. By early 1919, though, the National Kitchens Division had morphed from its original intentions, even morphed from what it had become, into now taking over the catering in royal parks. This is a further sign of its journey from popular, cheap communal dining to really catering for profit. These catering units in royal parks were soon charging more than affordable restaurants like Lyons that were popular at the time. Soon the National Kitchens Division is actually doing quite handsomely from its running of refreshments in London's royal parks. And still you've got people in the Kitchens Advisory Committee like Maud Pember-Reeves arguing in vain that, quote, arrangements for poor children should be made, and getting ignored by the likes of Kennedy Jones. And under Kennedy Jones, they morph from cut-price communal ventures into highly profitable and expensive park cafes. The Advisory Committee's Maud Pember-Reeves says there's quite an explosive meeting. Prices are excessive. They're unable to service large numbers of people, especially children. But they don't really... Kennedy Jones certainly doesn't mind at this stage, because the sites at Kensington Kew, Hyde Park and Primrose Hill alone had turned over 4,000 in 3 months. So for all the committee's social concern, it's clear to all concerned that national kitchens had morphed into something very distinct from their original purpose, something very distinct from the communal working class efforts that they were inspired by. The National Kitchens Division was eventually wound up in late 1919, and by the time it was wound up and its advisory committee with the likes of Reeves disbanded, you can really see that it's gone 180 degrees, because its last act as a National Kitchen Division is to feed hot cooked food to thousands of police called into London to deal with striking workers in 1919. So in 2 years, from 1917 to 1919, the National Kitchen, as it becomes, performs a complete 180 degree turn. And I will just conclude by saying that, to come back to, and that's, again, sorry, not a terribly great picture, but inside a national kitchen, that they are predominantly female run, even though they sort of taken over from the female run bottom up efforts of the egalitarian eating which inspire them. But the roots of the scheme, communal kitchens, are soon transformed, as hopefully I've illustrated, into depoliticised, top-down, patriotic national kitchens, which in turn are eventually run down in favour of expensive mini-ventures in royal parks. National kitchens then are part of an increasingly intensive state management of domestic affairs in Britain from late 1916 onwards, as the government moves towards greater control of food control, pricing, distribution and all the rest. By mid-1918, the Ministry of Food, as I've mentioned earlier, was talking confidently of national kitchens becoming a permanent national institution, and even talking about turning the restaurants in the House of Commons and the House of Lords into a national kitchen. A little more than a year later, though, their days were numbered. Now, according to Spencer, who was in charge of them, the demise of the national kitchen was all about class. Spencer said, and Spencer talking as a card-carrying Yorkshireman, that for all the ministry's efforts, members of the northern working class still viewed national kitchens as soup kitchens. Members of the northern male, he's talking about the northern male working class, go home for their dinner in the middle of the day. And Spencer admits that they'd proven more popular in London and the southeast, where a lot of the business a lot of people using them were sort of city clerks rather than industrial workers. And he contends the working class man travels home for dinner in the middle of the day. He knows the sort of the fish and chip bar, but he doesn't really want to go out to a national kitchen or a national restaurant. I think a more compelling reason is the opposition of the catering trade. The Ministry holds a meeting with the catering trade on the 11th of November 1918, of course Armistice Day, in which it proposes the establishment of public-private buying organisations for collective purchase of foodstuffs and the cooperative use of cooking equipment, so that good prices could be passed on to the consumer. The Caterers Trade Association votes against this scheme unanimously, unsurprisingly perhaps. But of course it's rationing which provides the fatal blow to national kitchens. Full rationing in 1918, guarantee of fair shares, if you will, on an individual or household basis, dampens this need for communal dining. By December 1918, Britons were enjoying sugar-coated cakes and double meat rations. The gradual lifting of rationing restrictions so soon after their implementation only made communal dining, the national kitchen, seem less attractive. Despite these trends, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the national kitchen could have persisted in the post-war period. Against the backdrop of increased unemployment, demand for cheap and nutritious dining was certainly widespread. Yet with the post-war downsizing of the Ministry of Food, leading to its 1921 disbandment, National Kitchens Division fails to find a new home and is consigned to the history books until being revived in the Second World War. Written off as an extraordinary war measure then, the national restaurant, as it had effectively become by the end of the First World War, wouldn't be revived until the Second World War, when of course those political anxieties about communism and communalism rear their head again. So the death of the national kitchen was, I think, a question of political will rather than public indifference. I think there was actually quite a lot of public support and demand for them. And its journey, one of voluntarism to statism, provides a brief and I think interesting moment, which now, and looking at the food bank Britain that we have now, this time when the government tried to feed everyone communally, albeit with some of the caveats that I've raised, I think seems very far off indeed. Thanks very much for your time.